Hey, Scott, how you doing?
Hey, Gary. Here to pick up my order.
Perfect timing. Just came out of the oven.
Good.
Okay, it's gonna be $9.49.
Here's a 10. You keep the change.
Thanks, Scott.
If I were to ask you what the pizza maker who made this delicious pizza and an iron worker have in common, you'd probably have to think for a while to come up with an answer. Well, I'll give you a hint. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. It's obvious, right? The answer is they both work in a hot environment.
Everyone knows that working in a hot environment is uncomfortable, but being uncomfortable is not the major problem. Workers who are required to work in a hot environment face additional but avoidable hazards that go beyond merely being uncomfortable. Generally speaking, there is a higher frequency of accidents in hot environments than in more moderate conditions. Working in a hot environment lowers the mental alertness and physical performance of an individual. Increased body temperature and physical discomfort promote irritability, anger, and other emotional states which can cause workers to overlook safety procedures or to divert attention from hazardous tasks. Certain safety problems, such as foggy safety glasses or dizziness, are common to hot environments. The best way to minimize these potential safety and health problems is to understand the physical stresses placed on your body by the hot environment, to recognize the symptoms of heat stress disorders, and to take the proper precautions to lessen or eliminate these stresses.
Do you ever wonder why you sweat? Or why you might feel a bit faint after a strenuous aerobics workout? Well, it might have something to do with the fact that we are warm-blooded animals. Some a bit warmer than others. This engine, when operating, generates internal heat. Now, your body, which is always operating, also generates internal heat, and like this engine, the harder it works, the more heat it generates.
The car's cooling system uses a mixture of water and coolant to keep the engine operating at the proper temperature. This mixture is pumped through the engine, absorbing heat.
Now, your body's cooling system works in very much the same way. Your coolant is your blood, and your water pump is your heart.
As the blood circulates through your body, it absorbs the heat generated by muscles and operating organs. Blood is then pumped to the surface of the skin, where it is cooled by the ambient air temperature. If this process is not sufficient to keep your body at its ideal operating temperature, the brain signals the sweat glands to pour out sweat. As the sweat evaporates, the skin is cooled, which in turn lowers the temperature of the blood.
This process, known as thermoregulation, is responsible for keeping your body's temperature fairly constant. Two factors, however, can overburden this process, causing your body to heat up, much like a car stuck in a traffic jam on a hot July day.
Increased physical activity, plus a hot and humid environment, can mean trouble for your body's thermoregulation system. As internal body temperatures rise, the heart begins to pump more blood to the surface of the skin in an attempt to cool it. With so much blood going to the external surface of the body, relatively less goes to the active muscles, the brain, and other internal organs. Strength declines, and fatigue occurs sooner than it would otherwise. You might feel faint or dizzy. Alertness and mental capacity also may be affected. Workers who perform delicate or detailed work may find their accuracy suffering, and others may find their comprehension and retention of information lowered.
That's just some of the problems associated with working in hot environments. In our next segment, we'll discuss 4 specific heat stress disorders and how to treat them. Excessive exposure to a hot work environment can bring about a variety of heat-induced disorders. These disorders may range from an uncomfortable heat rash to a life-threatening heat stroke.
While certainly not life-threatening, Heat rash, also known as prickly heat, is very annoying and uncomfortable. Heat rash is likely to occur in hot, humid environments where sweat is not easily removed from the skin by evaporation, and the skin remains wet most of the time. The sweat ducts become plugged, and a skin rash soon appears. When the rash is extensive or is complicated by infection, prickly heat can be very uncomfortable and may reduce your ability to perform your job.
The treatment for heat rash simply is one, prevention, and that is to wear loose-fitting clothing in a hot, moist environment. Or secondly, if you do get the heat rash, to use an over-the-counter antibiotic cream.
You can prevent this condition by resting in a cool place part of each day and by regularly bathing and drying the skin. Heat cramps or painful spasms of the muscles that occur among those who sweat profusely in heat, drink large quantities of water, but do not adequately replace the body's salt loss. Shortly thereafter, the low salt level in the muscles causes painful cramps. The cramps often occur in the muscles principally used during work, arms, legs, and abdomen. Sometimes, severe abdominal heat cramps are mistaken for appendicitis. Heat cramps are most prevalent during the first few days of heat exposure before the worker has become acclimated to the hot conditions. Once acclimatized, less salt is lost in the sweat and the potential for heat cramps diminishes.
The treatment for heat cramps simply is to get the person out of the hot environment into a cool one, to give the person who is having the heat cramps fluid, preferably a salt solution by mouth, or sometimes in a more acute or worse condition to give them IV fluids in a hospital situation.
Since the average American diet is high in sodium, additional salt supplementation is usually not required, and salt tablets are definitely not recommended. If your doctor has placed you on a low-sodium diet, you should consult him as to what to do if you get heat cramps.
Heat exhaustion includes several clinical disorders having symptoms which may resemble the early symptoms of heat stroke. Heat exhaustion is caused by the loss of large amounts of fluid by sweating, sometimes with excessive loss of salt. A worker suffering from heat exhaustion still sweats, but experiences extreme weakness or fatigue, giddiness, nausea, or headache. In more serious cases, the victim may vomit or lose consciousness. The skin is clammy and moist. The complexion is pale or flushed, and the body temperature is normal or only slightly elevated. In most cases, treatment involves having the victim rest in a cool place and drink plenty of liquids. Victims with mild cases usually recover quickly with this treatment. Those with severe cases may require extended care for several days. Heat stroke is a medical emergency. It occurs when the body's thermoregulation system fails and sweating becomes inadequate.
There are three things required for someone to have a heat stroke. One is the person needs to be in a hot environment. Secondly, the person needs to have an elevated temperature, typically 103, 104, 105. And thirdly, and most importantly, the person needs to have an altered mental status. That is, they're confused, they can have seizures, and ultimately they can go into a coma.
The body's only effective means of removing excess heat is compromised with little warning to the victim that a crisis stage has been reached.
The treatment for heat stroke at first is to get the person, again, out of the hot environment if you can. Secondly, remove all clothing. Try to sponge the person down with water or put wet, moistened towels over that person, and try to fan the person with some object if you don't have an available electrical fan in the situation. And then lastly, the person needs to be transported to the hospital as soon as possible.
This man will live because his co-workers recognized the problem and took immediate action. Early recognition and treatment of heat stroke are the only means of preventing permanent brain damage or death.